Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we're going to talk about a tough subject right now, and one that I know you had to deal with 4 years ago when your dad died. And also our guest had the same issue, and that is having self-compassion when you aren't there when that loved one dies. So let's be talking about that. And we've got a great woman on who is not only has suffered this personal loss, but she's also created an amazing film that we're going to be a documentary, Speaking Grief, that we're going to be wanting to talk about on the show too. So Heidi, do you want to introduce our guest today?
Sure. I love this topic. Like you said, Mom, it's near and dear to my heart. And I love the person that we're having on. She is a friend of mine, Lindsey Whissel Fenton. Lindsey has been on our public access television show. She was on our TV show, and she was on our TV show right before her mother died. So please go to Open to Hope and you can hear those shows that she did with us. And since then, unfortunately, her mother has passed away. Lindsey has a lot of things that she has done in the grief and loss world. She is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker and a grief educator. She is the creator of the Speaking Grief documentary and its sister initiative, Learning Grief. She is the founder of Empathic Media and the producer of the Apologies podcast. And she is on the board of directors of the National Alliance for Children's Grief. Welcome to our podcast, Lindsey.
Thanks, Heidi and Gloria. I'm so happy to be here. My mom had a rare form of blood cancer that she'd had for a couple years. We had just found out it progressed to sort of the mid-level stage, maybe a month before she died. And then ultimately it can progress. And in her case, it did progress to an acute form of leukemia. So we knew she was ill. She had been sick for a while, and I will also say she had a lot of other health issues on top of it. So she didn't have really a good day for quite a long time. She was in a lot of pain and discomfort toward the end. And she, as her illness progressed, had been hospitalized a number of times. And a lot of times I had made the decision to kind of go home. Not that I ever regret that, but you kind of never know. And so I would go home or decide it was I needed to get home. And so it's this weird calculus when you have someone with a long-term illness. And I actually, as I mentioned, I started writing about this, and I look forward to sharing what this turns into, of when you get a phone call that you have, like if you have a parent or someone in your life who has no prior illness and you get this phone call that they're, going to the hospital, it lands differently, I think, in your nervous system than when you've dealt with a long-term illness or something becomes routine. And even going to the hospital can become routine. For us, it was, okay, she's going in for another transfusion, or they're going to get her pain under control, or whatever the situation is. So the night I was going to New York that morning, and I was actually, the irony of this was I was planning on going home that Saturday. I had taken a week off work. I was going to go spend time with my family in Buffalo, the following week. This happened, I think, on a Tuesday, or Monday was when I was leaving for New York. So I was informed that she was having some issues. They were taking her to the hospital. This time was a little different. She ended up going in ambulance just because she was very faint, and my dad was having trouble getting her to the car. And so I think that's why I was a little bit more concerned when I went to New York, but it was still sort of this, I called and checked in with my dad, and he was kind of like, there's nothing you can do. And that was often what the dilemma was of, when someone has long-term illness like that, there's not much you can always do in the moment. And I said, well, okay, here, I was going to come home Saturday. Let me go to New York. I'll get back Wednesday morning, come home first thing Wednesday. And even at that point, he thought, she's probably not going to be released till Thursday. And I said, well, at least I can be there. I can get the house ready. But this to show that our whole family thought this was going to be sort of a normal hospital experience for us. And so I was checking in throughout the time I was in New York. we started, we went to film Tuesday night, ironically filming a series of interviews about grief. And right before we started recording, I actually got sort of a positive update where he said, oh, they finally got her pain under control. She's resting. And I thought, okay, whew. And then as soon as we finished, it was only maybe an hour later, he just texted, are you still in New York? And there was something about that. I just knew something had changed. So I immediately called him and he said, about 20 minutes ago or something, her breathing started to change. And I could tell in his voice something was not right. And I just said, is this like it? And he got a little teary and said, yeah, I think it is. And,
Wow.
then it was pandemonium of trying to get home. And I'm in Manhattan. My car is in Connecticut. I was kind of laughing later. I was like, I'm in a city with like 7 airports and I can't get from here to Buffalo, New York.
Mhm.
And, shout out to Heidi and our friend, Dr. Jill Harrington, who was also there as I was sort of, you never know how you're going to respond in those moments, but I'm usually very on top of things. And I was just sort of in that fog that anyone who's lost someone knows, where I just
Mhm.
couldn't, I was throwing things in my suitcase and all I kept thinking was, this isn't happening. This isn't happening. This isn't real. And you and Jill were on the phone with airlines and car companies and everything we could think of.
The thing that was giving you the most support in that moment, Lindsey, because you were so upset, which I totally understand, and we were on phones, is my dog. My
Mhm.
dog came up to you and just sat by you and stayed by you, and we tried to navigate all this stuff while you were emotionally trying to navigate it and text your family.
You're absolutely right. And I think even fast forwarding that, yeah, I'm very much an animal person, as Heidi now knows. And one of the dilemmas I had was my dog was, in Connecticut where I live, staying with friends. And so at the time I was thinking, well, I'll just get home and then I'll figure it all out later. But as it became more and more challenging for me to get from New York to Buffalo, I thought, well, I'll just get to Connecticut, get my car, get my dog, load up, and then I can stay as long as I need to. And the whole time I was talking to my brother and my dad, and my brother was also, he lives out of town, but he was actually traveling for work a little closer than where he lives. So he's trying to race home. I'm trying to race home. Long story short, I get in the car probably, I think it was right before about 2 in the morning. I'd only been driving for not quite an hour. Paul said, I think you need to pull over. Like we're just gonna
Mm.
FaceTime her. Like I don't think we're gonna make it.
Wow.
He was only about 15 minutes away. So it was, I felt, and I'll touch on that in a minute, but basically um said goodbye to her on the car and then had 5.5 hours left of driving alone through the night. I think I only slept about 15 minutes that night. And so much is coming up for me about that night that we can touch on, of, my best friend and how she supported me, of um the way things worked out. My brother ultimately didn't make it either, but I had the thought later, if I'm sort of grateful that neither of us were there, because I think
Mhm.
if one of us had been there and the other hadn't, whoever hadn't been would have had a harder time. But my dad was with her, so she wasn't alone, and he got there, quicker after I did. But so that was it, and I wasn't there. That was in July, and what I'm grateful about, which we can talk about, is a lot of work I've done on myself outside of my mom allowed me to get to a place of self-compassion so much more quickly than I ever thought I would be able to.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well, did your
mhm.
did your movie that you've done, your documentary on speaking grief, has that helped you? And you interviewed a number of people who had had losses, particularly child losses, right?
Lots of different losses. Yeah, so Speaking Grief was actually the first project I worked on in this space. That came out in 2020. That was the first time I met you and was on this podcast. And then since then, I've fallen so in love with grief literacy and grief education. I've done a number of other projects and sort of made that the sole focus of my work in public media, as creating educational initiatives around grief. Our newest being a project called Learning Grief, we can talk more about. But I think that helped me more in the aftermath. With the biggest thing, I think, is just normalizing that everything I'm going through, everything my family is going through, is normal. For me, especially early grief, was exhaustion. I would do one task and be wiped out and need to sleep for 2 hours, and I didn't freak out. I just knew, okay, this is what I need. I'm grieving. And that lasted a couple weeks. And then I sort of, regulated a little bit. So I think it normalized it. I also think it normalized me advocating for myself and not feeling any shame. And I'm very privileged and blessed that I have an amazing network of friends and also coworkers who stepped in for me and gave me the space I needed to just be in my grief and the feelings. But I think what hit me driving home, that first half of the road was that I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I can't believe I wasn't there. And then I found this self-compassion that had come through, therapy and work on myself through the years of just there was this, why didn't you, the first thing was, why didn't you leave Monday when you found out she was going home? And I was kind of sitting with that for a little bit. And then I just thought, because this was routine, and I was able to kind of step back at it and again look at what I talked about in the beginning of when this becomes normalized for you or your family in a way, you don't react the same way as when it's a sudden phone call and it is this ever never ending calculus of when should I go home, when should I stay, when there's so much at play. And I was just able to look at it from, this was a perfectly natural rational response. Everybody, not just me, thought it was a normal quote trip. We also, I want to touch on, had the what we thought was security of a prognosis. So her doctors were saying a year to a year and a half. I, for whatever reason, thought it was less than that. I figured 6 months to a year. But, we were all sort of thinking, again, this was July. I thought maybe we'll get one more Christmas. So even when someone is dying, you don't know when they're actually going to die.
Yeah,
And
I
so
agree, Lindsay. And even when you know someone is dying, you're still shocked when they do die. My father was sick also. And, I'd flown out to California from New York a couple of times during COVID to see if there was any way that they would let me into the hospital because I'd had COVID already. They wouldn't. But I kept thinking, you know what? He's eventually, I mean, he's not going to die, so it was still a shock to me when he actually died, even though I knew he was sick.
Well,
it is.
he'd had, 2 or 3 years before that, he'd been in the
Yeah.
hospital in intensive care.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shock to the system.
He
And
had
I
the
think
same thing, he had a staph infection. So, death can be sudden even though it's long.
Hmm.
I like your idea about you do normalize it. I think in the bottom, I mean, at the very basis, we do the best we can at the time.
that
I mean,
was exactly
Hmm.
it. I just came to this. Yeah, I took the information I had with how things had unfolded in the past. Nobody else in my family had, it wasn't just me. My brother did also, we all didn't immediately rush because we didn't think this
Hmm.
was be the end. And again, that kind of
Yeah.
false security of a prognosis, you think, well, the doctor said it's this long, so this is just another bump in the road of the progression to the next stage of the disease. We also didn't know until after she died that it had progressed to the next stage of the disease. And so just all of these things together, um, again, it was, we're human. And I immediately, I mean, not immediately, but within probably a couple hours came to this place that I'm just so grateful for of just, yeah, I did the best I could. I made the best decision I had, and the decision I made was rational given all of this information. And yeah, do I wish I could have been there? Absolutely. And I wasn't. And I had a moment with my mom. I had been home probably 2 weeks prior to that, and she was having a particularly rough time. She just had another surgery that was sort of unrelated to her primary illness that she ultimately died from. She was having a rough night, and she kind of looked me in the eyes and just said, like, I'm ready. I'm done. And
Mm.
so
That gives me chills.
yeah, it was, I put and I didn't have any, because of my work on speaking grief, I knew not to try to tell her to look on the bright side or anything. And so
Yeah.
I just sat, she's sitting in a chair. I put my head on her knee, and we just stayed like that for a long time. And I did kind of come to a place where I'm like, that was my goodbye with her. And that was
Hmm.
probably a better goodbye than I would have had in the
Yeah.
hospital. I did see her in the morgue after, and I did, then see her at the funeral home after. So I got that, I got to close my loop on that, which is a whole other thing to talk about of the experiences I had trying to get access to her. But yeah, I wasn't, so I guess those are my compassion thoughts, is like, I wasn't there. I would have liked to have been there, and I wasn't, and that's what happened.
So it sounds like the narrative and the change in it helped. What other things have helped you?
Definitely my dog. My friends, oh my goodness, may everyone who is bereaved or grieving anything be as blessed to have the support that I have had. Um, I noted, so I had to drive home all night. Uh, my best friend stayed on the phone with me pretty much in silence and just listened to me sob
Wow.
for 3 hours from
What
about
a
three.
great gift. What a great gift this friend gave you.
Oh, absolutely. And her father had died about a year and a half prior. And, I texted her to say my mom died. She called me and I can't even imagine what that's like as your friend to just hear me ugly cry for 3 hours straight. And all she would do is, every so often she'd be like, are you okay? Are you awake? Obviously I wasn't okay, but just making
Mm-hmm.
sure I was awake, that I was safe, and just stayed with me and didn't make me talk, just so I wasn't alone during that
That's
awful time.
great.
And then, oh, this is a weird thing that happened. I'll share too. At one point I said, okay, hold on, I gotta get gas. Probably 2:30 in the morning. I pull out at this random gas station. I'm the only one there, and I hear someone say, "Lindsey," and I look, my sister-in-law, who was coming from Portland, Maine, where my brother lives, we were the only 2 people at this gas station.
No,
And I just looked at her and I burst into tears and we just hugged each other, and then I took a selfie and sent it to my brother and my dad, and I just thought, okay, it was just one of those bizarre things.
that's amazing. That's
It helped you feel less alone on this awful,
mm-hmm.
awful drive. So
Little universe things. Well, give us a little shout out. Talk a little bit about your Speaking Grief documentary and the other things that you're doing.
Speaking Grief was our earlier project. So I have gotten to see the benefit that grief literacy can have. So I feel like I have gotten to benefit in a weird way from this work that I do, because I work with a team of people who have all now been immersed in grief education. I have a lot of friends in my network who are grief counselors, grief researchers. So I had that net, and I know what it's like to receive support from people who have some understanding of how grief works and what to do and what not to do. And my wish is that everyone get to benefit from that same type of support. And so what we did with Learning Grief, which came out this past spring. Learning Grief is not a documentary, it's a website. So at learninggrief.org, we took a lot of the same resources on understanding grief and supporting grief that are available on the speakinggrief.org website, and we looked at how can we really make a difference. And we realized what we have to do is we have to start with the next generation too. So we took all of those skills and resources and translated them for adults who want to learn to model and coach grief literate behavior in kids as young as toddlers. And we sort of scaffold on up through how you can start developing those fundamental skills like empathy and emotional literacy and mindfulness, and how to repair after a rupture in a relationship. And so we give adults the skills to model that for kids. And then I will say the probably biggest differences are Speaking Grief. We focused a lot on death related loss, although the materials apply to any loss. And in Learning Grief, we really took an expansive view of let's start recognizing all of the different types of loss and grief we experience. I think especially with kids, that way you can start getting people familiar with sort of the skills and the same feelings and reactions that will come up as when there is a death, so that these skills are already starting to be formed. And then when you do get that phone call or whatever the crisis is, you have something to go from. So the learninggrief.org is where that is. And again, there's just, we've had a lot of great researchers who've worked with us on creating these materials, and they're free and available for anyone. And on learninggrief.org, we also have materials available for teachers through PBS Learning Media. So we took some of
That's
the
great.
lessons and created activities for teachers to do in the classroom as well.
All right. And then you made your documentary where people were interviewed about their losses that people can get. Well, where do they find all this information?
So speakinggrief.org is where the documentary lives. Learninggrief.org is where Learning Grief lives. And then my work, people can go to lindseywisselfenton.com, and all of my work and research.
Awesome. It's great that everything you've done. Have you got one last piece of advice to somebody who's recently lost their mom?
Who I would say whatever you're feeling is right. You get to feel however you feel. And I would say let people support you. I think we don't like to feel like a burden and we forget I've been on both sides of this. I've supported other people. And I think we don't want to, we're so worried about burdening other people. We forget that it's actually a kindness to
Mhm.
trust people enough to allow them to show up for us. And often our people are so eager to find ways to show up for us. So if the help is being offered and you feel comfortable and safe accepting it, I would say people want to help you and it's an act of love to let them.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Lindsey, for being on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for everything that you're doing. And I know that your mom is your guiding light.
Thank you.
And Heidi and I want to thank you all for joining us on our show today. And we always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.